Hello everyone, Mimir here. Let's start the video by having a look at this character killing a tier 16 boss, so we roughly have an idea of what the power level of this character is currently at. Now the map mod is nothing too crazy. It reduces armor and block chance, which are both part of my defensive layers, so it just made me a bit more squishy and that's about it. And as you can see, my bossing speed is not exactly fast either. So what's the reason that makes this meme build worthy of a video? Well, one of the reasons is on the title or the thumbnail as the clickbait for this video, and that is the entire build costs less than 1x in the Expedition League at the time of making this video, and it is able to clear tier 16 maps at level 86. I mean, not gonna lie, I personally think that any build that is able to do that deserves a video on its own. But the main reason I decided to make this video is that this particular build has major problems to solve, and some of them are not even fully solved yet, so I was forced to make many questionable decisions along the way, which kinda make this build very broken, in a bad way. And yet, as much as it looks like it is stitched together with a bunch of garbage, it somehow still functions. And it works better than many of my other builds that cost 10 times more than this character. Now, for those of you thinking the flasks alone are more than 1x already, well, here is another clip without those quote-unquote expensive flasks. And you will see later in the video that the defensive aspects on those flasks are actually a bit more important than the offensive aspects. So these rare ones work just fine. Anyways, I will walk through my thought process of how this character was created from scratch, so you can see what I mean. I started with a concept, and that is to use as many skills as I possibly can while only pressing one button. And those skills have to serve a purpose, not just for the sake of having an extra skill out there. Now I have a few options here. The obvious ones are cast on crit, cast while channeling, spell slingers, bow skills with Assonance Chant and Poet's Pen. I rule out cast while channeling because it is too slow, and channeling skill roots you in place while doing damage, which is mostly bad in Path of Exile. I recently played with Assonance Chant with my machine gun turret already, so I don't want to use that again. So with the remaining options, Spell Slinger is the most appealing option to me because I haven't really touched on this skill before. And it also looks like I can pair that with Poet's Pen, so that's the combo I went with. As to cast on crit, if the character turns out to have enough accuracy and crit, which I doubt, I'll also find a way to add that in as well. Next is to decide what skills I want to put in Spell Slingers. While I was doing my research, an interesting combo caught my attention, and that is Flame Wall with projectiles. What happens is, when any projectile passes through a flame wall, the projectile will receive added fire damage. Sounds great, add that to the cart. So now I need some projectile spells. Since Flame Wall is fire damage, so scaling fire damage would be the obvious choice. Therefore we need to look for fire projectile spells. Fireball is just staring at me at this point, so add that to the cart. Then we have Rolling Magma and Blazing Salvo. However, I ended up not taking those because I was also planning to use Hydrosphere to increase my single target damage. Since I know projectile skills like Fireball usually won't be good at single target damage, using Hydrosphere means we also need to utilize Chain. Rolling Magma and Blazing Salvo doesn't really work with the chain mechanic, so the only other projectile spell that can utilize Hydrosphere chain combo effectively is Ice Spear. The bad news is Ice Spear is a cold spell. That means even with cold to fire support, I still have 50% cold damage remain on the skill, which makes scaling fire damage not as effective as it can be. The good news is, Ice Spear is particularly good at single target damage because it functions like Barrage, and we all know that Hydrosphere works well with Barrage. Since Fireball and Ice Spear are the only two projectile spells that works with Chain, that's all I'm gonna use. And here is another problem. Ice Spear has two forms. The second form will pierce through all targets. That is not good for our Hydrosphere synergy. So we need to use a Snake Pick ring on the right ring slot to disable the Pierce on Ice Spear. So add that to the cart. Moving on, here is how I allocate the skills. A 4-link to put Hydrosphere, Firewall, and Sniper's Mark on Spellslinger. And since the mana nerf on 3.15 patch, we can no longer afford to have Sniper's Mark linked here, so I have it separated out. Next, on the Poet's Pen, I decided to put Fireball here because it has less single target DPS than Ice Spear, so Ice Spear is using the 6th link. The Fireball is linked with Arcane Surge since triggered skill can now utilize Arcane Surge, but Spellslinger spells cannot because they reserve mana. So Poet's Pen and Flame Dash are the only place for this build to have easy access to Arcane Surge. And yes, I do also have a lower level Arcane Surge on my Flame Dash because I want to have as much uptime as possible for the mana regen. Anyways, the last slot is for Inspiration because it has reduced mana cost on it. This build is doomed to have a huge mana issue if you haven't already picked that up yet, especially after the mana nerf, so we need this for the build to function. And then for our main 6th link, Spellslinger, Ice Spear, and Cold to Fire are the hard requires. So I've got 3 sockets left to fill, and one of them has to be Inspiration, same mana reason as above. Then we have Combustion because it has reduced fire resistance while ignited by this skill, so it will benefit the damage of our Fireball. Last socket, I use Immolate because it gives the most DPS. Now to activate all the triggered skills, we need an attack skill that can be used by wand. I choose Frenzy because it gives us easy access to Frenzy Charge. I linked it with Power Charge on crit to also get some Power Charge. Then we have Inspiration Support because we can't get Inspiration charges from triggered skills, so we generate the charges here. And then lastly, Faster Attack to trigger everything faster. I put some cost on damage taken defense skills on the rest of the slots. We have Withering Step and Tempest Shield here, and then Steel Skin over here. We need as many defensive layers as we can possibly get since we only have 2.6k life. Now let's move on to the passive skill tree from here because it'll make more sense to discuss the rest of the gears later. And here is where we have to solve many functional problems. First up, we have to choose Deadeye instead of Elementalist, as many of you might have think as a more logical option, or even Assassin. That is because we need the additional projectiles and the +1 chain passives since we can't afford to use support gems to get them, because chain support has very high mana multiplier, and also there is literally no more sockets left for our Fireball to have any additional support gems. Otherwise, Elementalist would probably be better in many ways. And because we picked a Ranger class and our pathing does not give us enough access to life passives, that means our effective life pool is pretty much non-existent. On top of that, we do not have enough points to get dodge and evasion passives like most of the normal Ranger would get as one of their big defensive layers, which means we are extraordinarily squishy if we don't do something about it. And that's the next problem we have to solve. First, I use Ruby, Sapphire, and Topaz flasks to give me 20% to all elemental damage reduction. If you have the currency, the Dying Sun is the upgrade for Ruby Flask, and Taste of Hate is the upgrade for Sapphire Flask. I also have a Rumi's Granite Flask for some physical damage reduction. Now having these are far from enough, especially for our physical damage reduction, so I use a Ghastly Theater Shield for the physical ages, which gives me 1000 physical effective life pool. Once you do have the upgrade to Taste of Hate for the Sapphire Flask, it will convert 20% of the physical damage into cold damage, which is kinda like the extra 15% physical damage reduction. For example, when you take 100 physical damage, 20 of that damage will be taken as cold damage, which becomes 5 because you have 75% cold resistance. Now we want more of this kind of damage reduction because they are currently cheap and effective for us. So we use a Lethal Pride Timeless Jewel with Rakiata. This gives us Tempered by War, which converts 50% of cold and lightning damage into fire damage. Now here you might be wondering, since all our elemental resistance are 75% capped, wouldn't converting one elemental damage taken to another be pointless? And the answer is, of course it's not pointless, because for example, if a boss deals cold damage, it will either have some cold penetration or stuff like a frostbite curse that reduces 50% of your cold resistance, and therefore you will be resisting the cold damage with your weakened cold resistance. If we have this passive, then at least 50% of the damage is resisted by your usual 75% resistance. And yes, it will make the Crystal Vault armor be our best in slot because it has 2 damage taken conversion, which actually makes us even more tanky, even though it doesn't give us life. The armor I have right now is literally a random cheap 6-link armor that has big life on it. Nothing else is special about it. Now to tank up the character even more, I decided to get Overcharge passive over here, which mainly gives us endurance charge while mapping. This greatly reduces my death while going through maps, and we can't forget the Method of Madness over here purely for the 40% chaos resistance. And here we have another problem to solve, the mana reservation issue. You need every reduced reservation passives you can get your hands on so you can activate both Spell Singers and also have enough mana left to spend. You have Charisma here and 2 reduced reservation here and here. You probably also want the Conqueror's Efficiency Jewel over here because it gives reduced reservation and also reduced mana cost, which is our next problem, the mana issue. Because all triggered skill now cost their original mana, the mana cost of this character just goes through the roof. And since spell users does not have any easy access to mana leech, and mana on kill is not reliable enough, so mana regen is our only option for mana sustain. After I gave my character the Eternal Mana Flask that has Mana Flask effect does not queue, it still has heavy mana issues, so I had to get the Dreamer passive over here to have 10% mana cost reduction, and then Anoint's Righteous Decree to get another 6% mana cost reduction. We also need to get Prodigal Perfection, Mystic Bulwark, Deep Thoughts, and mana regen per power charge over here to barely keep up with the mana cost. So I'll also need to get the Arcane Will over here if the character is higher level. Our final problem to solve is Life Sustain. We do need the Doriani's Lesson on a large cluster jewel to solve this one. The only thing you need on it is Doriani's Lesson and that's it. But you also need one other passive skill on the cluster. It doesn't matter which one because the purpose of having the extra skill is so that the Doriani's Lesson will appear closer to the entrance of the cluster and you wouldn't have to spend extra passives to get it. After all that, we're finally finished with making the character functional. The rest of the gears are mainly to fix our stats, life and resistances. I used Yoke of Suffering Amulet here because it is a cheap option that fixes my resistance and my base stat problem at the same time. As for the Malachite's Ring, I put Lightning Golem in here to activate the Elemental Equilibrium. The ring will only activate Elemental Equilibrium on our Golem's damage, which is Lightning. And since Fire and Cold are our main damage, as long as the Golem are out, we will always have it at our advantage. This ring provides around 40% of our total DPS, so as a cheap option, I don't think there are any other ring that is better than this one. And because we are using golems, we also take the Golem Commander over here so they don't die as fast and we can summon 2 of them at the same time. As for the 2 other jewels that I haven't talked about yet, one of them is a very large Thread of Hope, which is one of the cheap ones, so we can save a few passive points. And then the Rolling Flame jewel gives Fireball a chance to inflict Scorch, and Scorch lowers fire resistance, which means more damage. The rest of the passive points are just on damage, life and stat. And that's it for the build. I don't really recommend anyone to try this build unless you are bored. The mana issue is still there. I still ran out of mana after firing 10 ice spears in a row with the mana flask active, so you will feel it when it comes to boss fights. You are still kinda squishy, especially when it comes to kills damage, and even though that can be fixed with more currency invested, it also means you are even more limited on your damage potential. And another problem is, because you need a lot of passive points just to make this build functional, it is not exactly a good league starter. So you will have to find other ways to level up and make a switch. And even then, you will be super squishy all the way, unless again you are bored and you have enough resources to solve those problems. The only reason I make this video is because some of the mechanics and ideas on this build are not that widely used or simply not that popular. And it's just hilarious to see how cheap and problematic the character is, and it's somehow still able to do tier 16 maps at a decent rate. So if you are the kind of person interested enough to try out a random build like this, I'm sure you'll end up having fun with it. Anyways, and that's it for today. Subscribe for extra mirror drop chance. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.